The great achievement of the two generations of archaeologists who worked on the wall from 1892 until 1939 was that they disentangled the relationship between the different elements. In that way, very briefly, this is the opening of the South Shields Museum, the same day as the Queen's coronation in 1953. That's probably why Richmond looked so bored. He would rather be at the coronation. Richmond and Wheeler were right to state that they had solved the great problems of the wall. The signal advantage of their work was that it opened up possibilities for wider discussions on the operation of the frontier. In their work and in our interpretations, they have all been helped by the fact that on Hadrian's Wall, all the various elements touch each other at some point so that relationships could be perceived and thereby a sequence of actions could be determined. The next step was to consider the reasons for these changes and their implications. In this way, we can approach an understanding of the purpose, function, and operation of Hadrian's Wall. The crucial point is that only archaeology can provide the answers. When the wall was first planned, there was in existence a line of forts in the main river valleys of the Tyne-Solway Isthmus, linked by a road known as the Staingate. The road ran from Corbridge, then the lowest crossing point of the Tyne, to Carlisle, similarly placed on the Eden. Along this road lay a series of forts, seemingly all established in the late 1st century. Corbridge, as you can see, marked, Vindolanda, Carvorren, Netherdenton, and Carlisle. This was not a frontier line as other forts lay to the north. In the 2 decades after 103 to 105, when troops appeared to have been withdrawn from these more northerly forts, new military installations were placed along the Tyne-Solway Isthmus. There was at least one fort at Brampton Old Church, examined by Richmond, 2 smaller forts at Haltwhistle Burn and Throp, and several towers which presumably acted as observation posts. To the west of Carlisle, it would appear that a fort was now added at Kirkbride on the southern shore of the Solway estuary. We know of no fort east of Corbridge apart from the undated site at Washingwell, Wickham, which faced east and not north. The plan was not only to add Hadrian's Wall to this existing line of forts and other military installations, but extend it eastwards to the lower Tyne. In the first scheme for Hadrian's Wall, there was to be a wall from the Tyne to the Solway. From the Tyne to the Irthing, it was to be built of stone, and from the Irthing to the Solway, of turf. In front was a substantial ditch, except where the crags or the Solway made its digging unnecessary. At every mile, there was to be a small military post, a mile castle in our terminology, through which access across the frontier could be obtained. In between each pair of mile castles were 2 towers, in our terminology, turrets. Their spacing implies the existence of a tower over the north gate of mile castles. The pattern of mile castles, now called mile fortlets, and turrets referred to as towers just for complication, continued beyond Bowness-on-Solway for over 20 miles down the Cumbrian coast, though without a barrier. The most striking feature of Hadrian's Wall was its size, top diagram number. A massive 10 Roman feet wide, the stone sector was unique, being at least twice the width of every other known Roman stone frontier barrier, some illustrated below. The turf section, however, at 20 Roman feet wide, was a more reasonable width, comparable to the turf ramparts of Roman forts. How to account for the considerable width of Hadrian's stone wall remains one of the continuing debates about the frontier. Until 1921, there was no discussion of this issue, for it was universally assumed that Hadrian's wall was defensive and therefore topped by a wall walk. In the first edition of the Roman wall, Bruce wrote of a battlement along the top. R.G. Collingwood in 1921 acknowledged the hitherto accepted view that the wall was seen as a military fortification like the wall of a town designed to repel or at least check invading armies, not in this case attacking the outskirts of any mere city, but those of a province. The Roman troops have always been imagined lining the top of the wall and from behind the parapet, entrenched as it were on the rampart walk, repelling the attacks of Caledonian armies that attempted to carry the work by breach or escalade. Collingwood set out to challenge this view, and his argument remains relevant. Collingwood argued that a Roman soldier was not equipped to fight from a defensive position. Provided with 2 spears and having thrown them, the soldier would simply be put out of action. At this time, Collingwood stated, there were practically no archers in the Roman army in spite of Forestier's nice drawing. Modern specialists in Roman weapons allowed for training in archery, but accept that it was not a major element in Roman military tactics at the time. Only 1 mile castle and 2 towers have produced arrowheads. This, however, is part of a wider pattern with, for whatever reason, weapons of all types, rare finds in mile castles and turrets. Collingwood accepted the existence of a rampart walk, though he saw it as an elevated sentry walk. In 1969, John Mann challenged even that, pointing out that there was no need for a sentry walk. Indeed, as we can see from other frontiers, not least the German palisade, that unless the Roman soldiers were in the Roman army acrobatic corps, they could not have patrolled along the top of a fence, even less fought from it. Access to a putative rampart walk has rarely been discussed. We assume that access was through turrets, but only 2 mile castles have produced any evidence for a stair. Recent work, however, namely at Regensburg, the legionary fortress, and Geriat el Garbia, which you see here in North Africa, have indicated that access from the gate tower to a fort rampart walk was not always possible. You can see the difference in height. If this was the case at forts, can we extend it to Hadrian's Wall? Unfortunately, we will never know the answer to that, and to argue from a fort to a linear barrier is dangerous, but the evidence from these 2 sites does challenge our assumptions. The existence of a wall walk seems to be deeply embedded in our psyche. I suspect that there are 2 reasons for this. A fixation on medieval castle and town walls, together with an assumption that Roman walls serve the same purpose, which they did not, and a belief that a wide wall must have had a wall walk. I thought at this point you might need to just have a little light relief. This is Marvel Man on Hadrian's Wall, with the approach of a light wall chariot to the right, as the caption states. This is deeply embedded in our psyche. The military commentator Edward Lookback has emphasized that a wall walk on the top of Hadrian's Wall would have been too narrow to be a satisfactory fighting platform. There seems to me to be little point in arguing about how wide a parapet would be required for daily use, but it is worth pointing out that if we are going to envisage a wall walk, we ought to consider not just a forward parapet, but also one to the rear, bearing in mind that soldiers will be patrolling in the wind, rain, and gloom some 15 feet, 4.5 meters above the ground. Such a wall does exist in North Africa. Though here, you can see to the left, rear parapet, but here the top was enclosed so that it clearly did not provide a fighting platform. The crucial question is, why was Hadrian's wall so massive? The contemporary linear barrier in Germany was a stout fence to the left, subsequently replaced by an earthen bank or ditch to the right. It was manifestly impossible to patrol along the top of either. Other Roman frontier stone walls were all much slighter than Hadrian's wall. Its unusual nature has led to some to look further afield. C. Stevens suggested that Hadrian was inspired by travellers' tales of the Great Wall of China. And you will see here there is a real rear parapet. It's probably to keep the tourists from falling off, but that's another story. Jim Crow has proposed a closer influence, Greek long walls. Hadrian was a Philhellene and would have been familiar with the Greek tradition of long defensive walls. To that may be added a further point. City walls were an aspect of urban life largely absent at that time in the western provinces. As a result, when asked what sort of barrier he wanted, Hadrian would naturally have described what he already knew, not least Athens, which is Hadrian's Gate, of course. Hadrian was interested in architecture and designed several buildings, and he was a man who knew his own mind and was not to be crossed. After a dispute, a philosopher once excused himself from correcting Hadrian by stating that you do not argue with a man with 30 legions at his back. What Hadrian wanted, Hadrian got, and it is a reasonable assumption that in this case he wanted an unmistakable barrier. But why did he want a barrier at all? Here we have to look at the construction of Roman artificial frontiers in a wider context. The largest extension of the Roman Empire since the time of Augustus occurred during the reign of Hadrian's predecessor, Trajan. What we tend to forget is that Trajan was seeking final wars against the empire's old enemies, Dacia and Parthia, against which Julius Caesar had planned campaigns before his assassination. For these wars, Trajan had to plan carefully, not weakening one frontier too much in order to create the armies to fight on another. It should come as no surprise that the earliest linear barrier on a frontier occurred under Trajan when also the lower grade troops known as numeri first appear on frontiers. Hadrian continued the policy of protecting frontiers, but without seeking further expansion. We can see this as an acknowledgement of the realities of military and political life in which the continued expansion of the empire was no longer a viable option. That's not to say that it did stop expanding. It's another matter. We might conclude that Hadrian underlined his policy by the creation of the strong linear barriers, a palisade formed of great stakes in the case of the German frontier, so great to be worthy of mention in ancient literature, and a massive wall in Britain. There is another issue in relation to Hadrian's love of all things Greek, which is the contemporary attitude of some of the Greek intelligentsia. Appian of Alexandria practiced law in Rome during the reign of Hadrian. In his History of Rome, written some years later, he stated that the Romans surround the empire with a great circle of camps. At the beginning of the next reign, the Greek orator Aelius Aristides delivered a speech in Rome before the imperial household in which he lauded the achievements of Rome. In this, he stated that the Romans had placed walls round the empire and encamped army, like a rampart, encloses the civilized world in a ring, he declaimed, from Ethiopia to the great outermost island towards the west, that is, to Britain. This perception found its physical expression in a sculpture. Do you know? I haven't put it in, sorry. I am fallible. This perception found its physical expression in a sculpture about the year 200 found in Rome, which shows the imperial baton representing the imperial city surrounded by a wall and forts, just exactly as Appian and Aelius Aristides described it. Ridiculous, I published the flipping thing. These are the views which have come down to us from some members of the Greek elite. There were others, such as Flavius Arrianus, who served in the Roman army, and in his case wrote military treatises. We can only assume that the comments of such Appian and Aelius Aristides were shared by others, and Hadrian, on his many visits to the Greek East, will have not only imbibed these opinions, but, knowing the man, most likely have debated them with Greek philosophers. It would not be going too far to suggest that the Greek attitude to imperialism, together with the emperor's knowledge of Greek city defences, may have lain behind his decision to protect the empire with walls as much as his appreciation of the manpower strains under which it was suffering. To turn from the barrier to the installations along the frontier, there was a tower at every third of a Roman mile, and we presume, therefore, that there was one over the north gate of each mile castle so as to maintain a regular pattern. What was the purpose of these towers? They could be used as observation posts, bases for signalling, or perhaps simply for shelter. The generally accepted view has been that the turrets were provided for observation. In 1986, David Croft brought a greater degree of sophistication to the table. He noted, this is very complicated. Don't even try to follow it. It doesn't matter. The point he's making is that he noted that several mile castles were pulled slightly out of their measured spacing and argued that this was to allow the soldiers in their towers to maintain contact with the troops in the fort behind the wall on the Stane Gate. And this is where all the signals are coming to on the sites along the Stane Gate. This relationship was emphasized by John Poulter in 2009, who pointed out that the wall was not built on the forward slope of the ridges along which it runs, but on the southern edge, so as to allow the soldiers in the towers to maintain contact with the military bases to the south, as you can see. The result of these observations is that we can now see the wall in its original plan, closely integrated with the existing forts on the Stane Gate to its south, with the implication that it was to maintain a 24-hour watch. Hadrian's Wall was indeed carefully planned. Albert Folio has recently joined the debate. He has noted that the interval of 500 meters between the towers is very close to the 450 meters, which is the maximum distance where military uniforms, therefore friend or foe, military or civilian, can be recognized, and concluded that their rigid spacing was probably designed to maximize the resolution of the observation scheme. It might be regarded that Folio's conclusions damage the case for a wall walk serving any purpose. The Mile Castle not only provided a tower, but also a gate through the wall and protection for the soldiers on duty. The size of the two earliest Mile Castles to have been built, 47 and 48, this is 48, appear to have provided sufficient accommodation for 32 men. We do not know the source of these soldiers. Each turret held perhaps 6, possibly 8 soldiers. The lower figure would have totaled 44 men per mile. 3,500 for the whole wall. Soldiers strung out along the wall in this manner were hardly a defence force. Mark Corby has informed me that a modern army would seek a defence force of at least 200 infantry and 30 cavalry per mile. Instead, defence of the province lay in the hands of the army unit based in the forts immediately behind the wall and those further south in its hinterland. The distinction between the troops on the wall lining the mire castles and turrets and those to the rear is of fundamental importance. Collingwood distinguished between the role of the continuous wall and that of the line of forts such as those on the Staingate. For while the latter contained bodies of troops intended to cope with armed enemy forces, the continuous line was at first designed to serve simply as a mark to show where the Roman territory ended. With this primary function was combined the secondary function of being an obstacle to smugglers or robbers or other undesirables. Our appreciation of the linear barrier as an obstacle has been increased in the last decades by the discovery of pits, you can see, on the berm of the wall in several places. Each pit held 2 great posts, presumably the lower parts of trees with sharpened branches, intending to impede the crossing of the frontier. Luttwak has emphasized that a linear barrier increased the reliability and effectiveness of surveillance by Roman soldiers and reduced the manpower required for protection against infiltration. The obstacle could be crossed, but not very quickly. The pits should be seen in this context. Now, it might be thought to be totally over the top to build a barrier as massive as Hadrian's Wall to prevent smuggling. But there is no doubt that the Romans liked to control access to their space. 50 years before the building of the wall, a tribe living across the Rhine stated that up to that point, the Romans have closed rivers and lands to keep us from meeting together with their colleagues inside the frontier, or to make us meet unarmed and almost naked, under guard, and paying a price for the privilege. Tacitus also recorded the position of the Ermunduri north of the Danube, stating that as they were loyal to Rome, they were the only Germans who trade not on the riverbank but inside the frontier. They cross over at all points and without a guard. To other people, we only show our arms and our forts. To them, we open our townhouses and country mansions. Moving a little later in time and further down the Danube, we are fortunate to have details of 4 treaties between the Romans and their neighbours in the 170s. These show that the Romans differentiated between the inhabitants of the neighbouring states, not allowing some to attend markets in case they undertook spying activities. Finally, to these literary references, we can add the testimony of the travel permits on sherds of pottery, bottom right star now, from the eastern desert of Egypt. These help to control movement in the frontier zone. One example will suffice. Q. Appius Optatus, to the 4 officers of the posts of the Claudianus route, let pass Exclibiades. In the face of all this evidence for control, it is perhaps not surprising that the Romans erected the most secure form of control, a linear barrier. People are still building these in the United States, in Morocco, in Israel, and across Europe. All these barriers are not to prevent the invasion of armies, but the movement of individuals and the operation of modern bandits and raiders. This was surely the purpose behind the decision to build the linear barrier which was Hadrian's Wall. Descriptions of military installations and their purposes rarely appear in the literary sources, but inscriptions are more helpful. I'm not going to attempt to interpret this for you. Inscriptions in modern Hungary record that in the 180s, this is what this inscription says: Commodus fortified the whole stretch of the river bank with towers built from the ground up and with garrisons stationed at suitable points to prevent surprise crossing by bands of bandits. That is, of course, the Sarmatians living in the great Hungarian plain. It would be difficult to find a clearer description of the purpose of Roman frontiers. Raiders indeed are recorded on every Roman frontier, and the Romans took action against them. For example, establishing fortlets for the protection of travelers or closing down a route used by invaders. A document from the eastern desert of Egypt records an attack lasting 2 days on a Roman fort by 60 barbarians, in which 1 soldier was killed and a woman and 2 children taken. And in what we might regard as a modern twist, the raiders executed one of the children. In such circumstances, there would be Roman reprisals. In Britain, we have an inscription from Kirksteads recording the successful achievements beyond the wall. An altar from Corbridge, the slaughter of a band of Corionotatai, while a dedication in Carlisle has been restored to refer to a similar action. Large-scale invasions as today were rare. Luttwak is strong on the role of linear barriers in such an event. Then the linear barriers were the last line of defense, as their function was only to provide the jumping-off place for mobile operations. That brings us to the final point which Collingwood made in 1921, related to the fighting tactics of the Roman army. As Collingwood put it, when large forces from the north advanced upon the wall and attempt to penetrate it, we cannot imagine that the Roman cohorts actually lined up on the rampart walk to repel them. Still less that Hadrian's engineers even contemplated such a proceedings. They threw open the north gates and marched out to fight them in the Roman manner. The Romans were an aggressive people who did not win their empire by sitting behind walls. Rather, they preferred to fight in the open where, mostly, they won. For me, this is the decisive argument. We may quibble about the existence of otherwise of a rampart walk, and in the most recent discussion, Paul Bidwell has acknowledged that there is insufficient archaeological evidence to be sure either way. But to argue that the Roman soldiers fought from the top of the wall is to fly in the face of all that we know about Roman fighting tactics. In Collingwood's view, the military defence of the province lay in the hands of the army units spread across the hinterland of the wall. In his words, the bodies of troops intended to cope with armed enemy forces. Consideration of the purpose of the gates through the wall leads us to a major change in Hadrian's Wall during its construction. In fact, not far into its construction. The major change was a decision to increase the strength of the military forces in the frontier zone, including by constructing new forts astride the wall, as you see at Chester's, which sat on top of an earlier turret. At this point, it is doubtful if any part of the linear barrier had been erected to full height, or even to the stage where scaffolding would be required. and for many miles only the foundations of the stone wall had been laid. It is difficult to state what progress had been made on the turf wall, but it is likely that work had started on its construction. As we have seen, there were only 7 forts across the isthmus from Corbridge to Kirkbride before the wall. There were none down the Cumbrian coast, though inland there was a fort at Pap Castle and a smaller installation at Caermont, together with other forts, as we've seen, in the hinterland of the wall, on the roads leading south from Carlisle, Carvorran and Corbridge. The decision to increase the number of military units in the frontier zone, generally known as the Fort Decision, resulted in the construction of an additional 20 forts, 21 if Hardknott is included as being required to link Ravenglass to Ambleside, while at least 4 forts on the Staingate were rebuilt. 25 forts were rebuilt or units moved. The secondary nature of many of the forts is demonstrated by the relationship to the work already underway. Chester's again. At least 3 forts overlaid demolished sections of the wall and the wall ditch, 5 over turrets and a Mar Castle, which had been built, or at least started, when the measured position of a tower underlay one of the forts on the Cumbrian coast. The advanced forts at Bewcastle, Netherby and Burren's top left were not attached to the wall, and so their relationship to other elements cannot be proved. I have argued that they were part of the first plan on the basis that there was a causeway across the ditch at Marcastle 50 TW, bottom Marcastle, which was left to take the road to Bewcastle. The work of Humphrey Welfare in identifying other original causeways across the wall ditch in front of Marcastles has destroyed this argument. Now I think there can be little doubt that most, if not all, the advanced forts are part of the revised plan. It used to be thought that at this stage the existing forts on the Staingate were abandoned and their units moved up onto the wall line. But while Brampton, Kirkbride and the 2 smaller forts appear to have been abandoned, Corbridge, Vinderland, Carvorran, Carlisle and probably Nether Denton continued in occupation. This created a total of 25 forts along the frontier zone. In manpower terms, the Fort Decision saw a rise from about 3,500 to 4,000 troops in the forts in the frontier zone at the beginning of Hadrian's reign to at least 15,000, the equivalent of 3 legions. Forts were abandoned across northern Britain and Wales to provide units for the new military deployment. Over a third of the total number of auxiliary units in Britain was on the move. This is a considerable step change. Hadrian's Wall moved from a lightly held barrier with, to its immediate rear, a handful of regiments providing protection for the province, to a strongly fortified corridor. Why was this? What had happened to lead to such a change? This question is not easy to answer, but in order to explore it, we must first examine both the new arrangements and the consequences for the original plan of this radical step. What is interesting about the first series of new forts is that many were placed astride the wall, certainly where possible, a unique arrangement not replicated anywhere else in the empire. The advantage of this position, that instead of the army having to file through a single Marcastle gate at any one point along the frontier to get to grips with an enemy, now there were 6 equivalently sized gates opening north of the wall at each fort. The most obvious implications are that the army intended to operate north of the wall and that this arrangement improved its mobility in the frontier zone. It would appear that this was important to the Romans, for the placing the forts astride the wall involved reversing work already undertaken, as we have seen. To improve access behind the wall, 2 new single portal side gates were inserted into the fort walls, another unique arrangement. If the fort decision resulted in more troops operating to the north of the wall, can we see any effect on the original plan? Matthew Simons has already directed our attention to one, a change in the size of the Marcastles. We have seen the large Marcastle 48 and its neighbour 47 were built early in the programme. All other Marcastles on the stone wall are smaller, with reduced accommodation facilities, as you can see. Grafstall has placed these changes after the fort decision. We can see that with so many forts on the wall now, it might have been an appropriate action to reduce the number of soldiers based in each Marcastle. This action leading to a reduction in the size of the enclosure. The effect of the Marcastle decision was to halve the total number of troops in the Marcastles and turrets along the wall. The other main change would appear to date to after the fort decision was the narrowing of the wall. The original intention was to construct a wall 10 Roman feet wide, which was reduced a little by offsets above the footings. Before completion, this was now reduced by 2 feet or more here at Brunton, in some locations here by as many as 4 feet. This leads to the question that if the experienced Roman army had judged 10 Roman feet an appropriate width for a putative wall walk, why was it reduced in width? This is a photograph which came to me from Brenda Swinback, as then was Brenda Hayward, as she became. And it's very rare that you can get a photograph of people standing on top of Hayden's wall. But the crucial thing, this is the narrow wall. Look how narrow it is. I mean, just you've got 2 people standing there. You could hardly move with a parapet at the front and a parapet at the back. The other main change would various reasons have been offered for the narrowing of the wall. These include the suggestion that a narrow wall would be more stable, which it wouldn't, a desire of the army to speed up work on a project which was already increasing in complications and therefore duration, and that it was a useful saving in materials. One possibility which I do not think has been considered before is that the placing of the forts on the wall and the concomitant operation of soldiers in the north would have negated any requirement for a wall walk. Nevertheless, security along the wall remained a concern. This presumably accounts for the construction of an extra turret at Peel Gap to provide observation of dead country immediately to the north. A different arrangement was made at Walltown, where 2 turrets, 44B, Mucklebank, and 45B, were moved out of their measured positions so as to observe better re-entrance in the line of the wall. Graham Stobbs has suggested to me that the requirement for turrets in these locations might imply that there was no wall work. I'm hammering the nails in as fast as I can. These changes, the reduction in the size of Marcastles and in the width of the wall, as well as the placing of forts on the wall line, had the effect of downgrading the importance of the linear barrier within the framework of military deployment across the northern isthmus. This was also the effect of another change to the original plan, the construction of a great earthwork behind the wall from Newcastle to Bowness, the Vallum. This consisted of a central ditch with a mound set back on each side. The ditch could be crossed at forts, though there appear to have been gaps in the north mound at Marcastles, as if travellers moved along the north berm from forts to mile castles. The important point is that the Vallum tightened control of movement in the frontier zone and again downgraded the importance of the linear barrier itself and of movement through it. One plan of the original plan at the top, which I'm calling Plan A, was that the wall not only got in the way of raiders and more serious enemies, but it also restricted the movement of the Roman army. The new arrangement for forts astride the wall were dealt with that. But was there anything more sinister at play? There are three elements which we now have to take into account. The evidence for serious warfare in Britain early in Hadrian's reign, the building of the west end of the wall in turf, and the placing to the north of this sector 3 advanced forts, together with the continuation of the pattern of fortlets and towers down the Cumbrian coast, and the construction of the Vallum. Literary evidence is notoriously difficult to use. If it exists, how far do we trust it? If a statement does not exist in our literary sources, how far does this reflect the lack of actions to report, or merely lack of interest on the part of the reporter? What we do have for Hadrian's reign are about half a dozen records of warfare in the province. The first is a report by Hadrian's biographer 250 years after the event that at the beginning of his reign, the Britons could not be held under Roman control. A coin issue has on its reverse Britannia, described as armed and at rest. All agree that the coin was issued between 119 and 128, but Richard Brigstock, having looked again at the evidence, is content with a date in or close to 119. The reverse indicates a successful completion of a military campaign, presumably that implied in the biography just cited. The discharge of a large number of soldiers from the army of Britain recorded in this document in the first half of 122, this dates the 17th of July, 122, as recorded on this diploma, presumably demonstrates that warfare was over by this date. We do not know the reason for the warfare. The strength of the army of Britain had been reduced following the Roman success at the Battle of Mons Graupius in AD 83, with the withdrawal of 2 legions for action elsewhere. We can see from other frontiers that when Rome relaxed its guard, its enemies flexed its muscles. The weakening of the army of Britain in order to support Trajan's campaigns may have been the catalyst for the trouble in the island. The second observation of warfare in Britain is by Cornelius Fronto, consul, senator, and courtier. In a letter to Marcus Aurelius, in his new position in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, in a letter in 162, he compared the loss of troops in Britain in Hadrian's reign to the many killed in the Bar Kokhba rebellion in Judea, which broke out in 132. Unfortunately, Fronto did not provide an exact date for the event in Britain, but the centurion buried at Vindolanda was presumably one of the casualties. The final pieces of evidence are of a different nature. 2 inscriptions referred to an expeditio Britannica. This term normally, though not always, is used when an emperor was present, and there was no emperor present in the warfare of 117 to 119, so the expeditio was presumably in 122 and referred to Hadrian's visit of that year. One officer on the expeditio was Pontius Sabinus, who brought 3,000 legionaries to reinforce the army of Britain, presumably to replace the losses in the fighting. Another officer recorded in the expeditio was Marcus-Agrippa, the commander of the first Spanish cohort based at Maryport, and his career inscription at his hometown of Camerino in Italy records his service in the Expeditio. Warfare there was, but we must be careful in relating this to the building of Hadrian's Wall. As Horsley remarked in 1732, the wall would not have been built until the Romans had driven the enemy so far to the north as to render them incapable of giving any interruption to the Romans when carrying on the work. We should not envisage Hadrian's Wall being erected during warfare, but only on its completion. The construction of the West End in turf has often been seen as indicating pressure on that area and a requirement for a quick fix to deal with it. Other explanations have been offered, including the lack of limestone required to help build a stone wall west of the Red Rock Fault, that is about Marcastle 53, and the lack of appropriate timber in a landscape farmed for 4 generations. There are 2 problems with regarding the turf wall as an urgent measure intended to deal with security forces in the West. First, in my view, and Horsley's, the Roman army would have dealt with any trouble in advance. Second, the size of some of the stones used in building the Marcastles in the stone sector was substantial. They were larger than were necessary and emphasized that the wall was to be seen as a permanent structure. It would seem strange to build part of the wall at speed and the rest at leisure. The choice of turf or stone may simply have related to availability. It seems that appropriately sized timber was scarce across the whole region. In the wetter west, however, turf was readily available, while in the central sector, where the underlying rock was close to the surface, turf would have been scrappy, but stone was plentiful. In the east, 4 millennia of cultivation would have reduced the available turf again, but here also stone was available. It is also worth noting that the Romans were not ashamed to build in turf, as the ancient reference to the Antonine Wall being constructed of turf demonstrates. North of the turf wall are 3 outposts or advanced forts. Various reasons have been offered for their existence, including that they protected part of the state of the Brigantes, left isolated beyond the wall. The continuation of fortlets and towers down the Cumbrian coast to modern Maryport suggests that a threat was perceived from beyond the Solway. And indeed, if you go today to Maryport, and a photograph doesn't capture this, Criffel is right in front of you. The bottom line is that we really don't know the reason for the advanced forts, nor for the extension down the Solway coast. It may be relevant that most elements along this coast were not reinstated on the return from the Antonine Wall, implying the lack of a threat. One might regard the Cumbrian coast installations as an overreaction, as indeed in some ways was the whole of Hadrian's Wall. The final element in this part of the discussion is the Vallum. Many reasons have been offered for the addition of the Vallum to the portfolio of installations which make up Hadrian's Wall. These include that it was a second line of defense, it was to prevent castle rustling, it was to protect the military zone, it was a temporary measure. If we look at the effect of the creation of the Vallum, it was to increase frontier control, restricting the number of crossing points from an original 82 to 13. Surely that is relevant, especially within the framework of the build-up of military deployment along the frontier itself. If that was the case, the construction of the Vallum may have been a reaction to events in the area, perhaps opposition to the construction of the wall. Otherwise, it is difficult to construe archaeological evidence as indicating that the Romans experienced any problems when it came to building the wall. Why and how did the decision to implement the fort decision Plan B come about? Hadrian's wall is distinctive in two ways. First is the irregularity in its planning, and second is the unusual features. The regularity in planning is reflected in the spacing of the marcasses and towers throughout the 100 miles from Wallsend to Maryport. This hints at a plan prepared somewhere else. The unusual features include not only this regularity, but the invention of the mile castle, the placing of the forts astride the wall, and the construction of the Vallum. As Stevens remarked, they all point to the involvement of Hadrian and his fertile imagination. Into this mix, we have to consider the time scale. Of particular interest is the dating of the timbers used to build the German frontier. These were felled in the winter of 119-120, over a year before Hadrian's visit, and they point to advanced planning. The same planning is reflected in 3 milestones in Britain, dating to the early years of Hadrian's reign, which probably reflect preparations for the imperial visit 2 years ahead of the event. Imperial visits cannot be arranged overnight. We see that on state visits, don't we? In the case of Hadrian's arrival in Britain in 122, it had to articulate with his visit to Germany beforehand and to Spain afterwards. We are probably looking at the decisions to visit the northwest provinces of the Roman Empire and to build frontiers being taken at least 2 years before the event. How does this relate to other activities? Hadrian succeeded his cousin Trajan in August 117. The army's control over Trajan's recent conquest was unraveling. And the situation was exacerbated by an uprising of the Jews in the eastern provinces. Hadrian took quick action. Trajan's newly acquired eastern provinces were abandoned. The emperor then travelled across modern Turkey to the lower Danube, where in 118 he ordered the abandonment of some of Trajan's conquests across that river in the face of an uprising by the Roxolani. The governor of the province, the top blue dot, was Pompeius Falco, an experienced officer. And it seems highly likely that Hadrian personally communicated to Falco his transfer to Britain to be governor there. Falco retired from his British governorship in the first half of 122, has again demonstrated this, because the soldiers are disbanded under Falco, but the documentation didn't come through till the new governor arrived on the 17th of July 122. So we could tie this down very tightly. So Falco's governorship ended probably at the beginning of 121. A normal office of 3 years would have brought him to the island in 119. The dates fit. In the spring of 118, Hadrian met Falco and gave him his new orders. It would take some months for Falco to travel across the empire, so 119 was probably the first year of campaigning. 3 years in the province would lead to retirement in the winter of 121 to 122. Hadrian's decisions to abandon many of Trajan's conquests were taken in the early months of his reign. As we have seen, the evidence suggests that the decision to build the German and British frontiers was probably taken at the same time. These decisions, the abandonment of territory too troublesome to hold and the construction of barriers elsewhere, were an unmistakable announcement of Hadrian's new policy of containment. As we have noted, it may be no coincidence that the decision was taken in the Greek East, an area familiar with long walls, and within a milieu where some of the elite eschewed militarism. It is entering the realms of speculation, which is a polite word for historical fiction, to suggest that Hadrian sketched out a plan for the wall at the meeting with Folco, but the original plan for the wall does look as though it was drawn up somewhere else than on the spot, and emperors, of course, did issue instruction to governors on their appointments. In other words, to put it coarsely, it was drawn up on the back of a cigarette packet. We cannot tie down the exact date of the arrival of the new governor, Pompeius Falco, in Britain, nor any details of his governorship. The evidence, such as we have it, suggests that he had dealt with the trouble recorded at the building of Hadrian's reign by the end of 121 at the latest. And it is likely that following surveying and troop movements, he started building the new frontier before the imperial visit in the following year. This is indicated by an inscription found top left near my castle 47. The inscription does not bear the name of the governor recorded elsewhere at work on the wall, and it lists the titles of Hadrian in a fuller form than usual. Graustal has suggested that the inscription is not later in Hadrian's reign, as long supposed, but earlier, as on structural grounds is the Mile Castle. His conclusion is that this stretch of wall, early in form, was built in advance of the imperial visit, probably to show the emperor what his wall would look like. Be that as it may, it seems highly likely that the radical change, which I have called Plan B, made so early in the building program, resulted from the emperor's visit and his appraisal of the military situation in North Britain. Ironically, in view of Hadrian's decision to halt the expansion of the empire, Hadrian's wall was turned from a defensive barrier into an offensive line, a springboard for military operations north of the wall, as Bruce appreciated 150 years ago. Perhaps Hadrian just thought that attack was the best means of defense, and in that he would be reflecting Roman military traditions. Luttwak calls them the tactics of forward defense. The statement by Cornelius Fronto on the scale of Roman losses in Britain is surely pertinent here. Although we have no figure assigned to Roman deaths, Dio stated that 580,000 Jews perished in the Bar Kokhba uprising, and it is possible that the war led to the annihilation or disbanding of a Roman legion. This was a serious war, and the event in Britain was compared to it. It would seem likely that it is against this background that we should see the initiation of Plan B. Perhaps Hadrian, 2,500 kilometers away on the lower Danube, thought that his wall could deal with the problem. On the spot, I suggest that realism kicked in and a more aggressive solution was adopted. Plan B involved considerable additional work, the abandonment of 20 forts, the construction of 20 new forts, and the move of 20 regiments. No wonder there is evidence for a long hiatus at various places during the building program. This takes several forms. The original broad foundation, which you see here, might be ignored by later builders, or work suspended so long that they became overgrown. At Bird Oswald, a layer of soil covering the soil covered unfinished buildings within the fort. At Chester's, the turret was demolished. There was quite a lot of debris in the ditch to the north of it, suggesting quite a break between the two. At Great Chester's, that's Bird Oswald at Great Chester's, Castle 43 was built and occupied with work on the fort ditches started, but abandoned before soldiers returned to demolish the Castle and build a smaller fort. welfare has pointed to the incomplete state of the wall ditch in some areas, while the upcast mound, as here, was not always smoothed off. There are few inscriptions to help us date the building of Hadrian's Wall. The name of the governor, Aulus Plautius Nepos, who arrived, as we've seen, in July 122, probably from Lower Germany with Hadrian, appears on inscriptions at 4 Mar castles, also on an inscription at the forts of Benwell and Halton Chesters, which are likely to have been amongst the first to have been built following the implementation of Plan B. Other inscriptions attest work on the advanced forts and on the Cumbrian coast during the reign. One of the last may have been Great Chesters, which has produced an inscription dating to between 128 and 138, while building work was in progress at its neighbouring fort right at the very end of Hadrian's reign. In this scenario, work on the wall, the building of which was conceived at the very beginning of Hadrian's reign, was still in progress and incomplete at the very end. To recap, Plan A comprised a linear barrier of massive proportions, supplemented by a new invention, a Mar castle, and with a regular series of towers fronted by a wide and deep ditch. Both wall and ditch were larger than any other such features on Rome's frontiers to date. This plan bears all the hallmarks of a scheme devised at some distance from northern Britain. The time required for instructions to cross the empire, for planning, surveying, the marking out of the landscape, and the assembling of the building force will allow for the initial decision to be taken by Hadrian when considering a large range of foreign policy and frontier actions on his journey from the eastern provinces to Rome in the early months of his reign. The very location of the decision to build the wall, I would believe, the Greek East, may have directed the Philhellene emperor to Greek parallels, long walls, the city walls of Athens, while his thoughts may have been affected by the attitude of certain Greeks to expansion, or rather to the lack of it. Yet as implemented, Hadrian's Wall was not intended to be a quick fix. The very size of the stones used in the Mar castles of the stone wall demonstrates that. Moreover, to build a frontier like this while undertaking campaigning would fly in the face of normal Roman practice, which was first to defeat the enemy in the field. Hadrian's Wall was built after a Roman victory. Hadrian came to Britain in 122, and it is hard to escape the conclusion that it was the emperor himself who took the far-reaching decision to undertake a radical change through the abandonment of at least 20 forts to the south and the building of a similar number of new forts along the line of the wall and down the Cumbrian coast, supplemented at that time or immediately after by the construction of the Vallum all the way along the wall from Newcastle to Bowness. These additions led inexorably to a slowing down of work on the original plan, to changes like the narrowing of the wall and probably to a reduction in the number of soldiers in the Mar castles and therefore the size of these structures. It's equally difficult to avoid the conclusion that Hadrian was impressed by his own assessment of the military situation on the northern frontier. Plan A, we can believe, was conceived far from northern Britain, perhaps even before the full scale of the troubles in Britain were appreciated. There is much to be said for accepting that Plan B was a reaction to the very serious warfare that Fronto mentioned, and which may have been the result of the weakening of the army of Britain in order to provide troops for Trajan's wars. Hadrian's decision, Plan B, may have led to a slowing down of progress on the building programme, but it is worth noting that the basics remain the same. The wall might be narrowed, but it remains substantial. The marcastles and turrets were completed, though some might be moved out of their measured positions. The use of large stones in gateways continued. Whether the wall was completed at the emperor's death is a moot point. How long it took for the army to appreciate the implications of Plan B for Plan A will be considered after coffee and tea. Thank you.